Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Idiotsplaining, the podcast where we break down the big stuff, the small stuff, and everything in between, all while keeping things as simple and, well, idiotic as possible. I'm Ross, your host, your guide, and your tutor. Today, we're diving into something that might give you a bit of nostalgia or a mild case of anxiety. It's all about going back to primary school. Yes, we're talking to the years 4, 5 and 6 students for this one. Those awkward formative years where your biggest concern was whether you could finally run faster than Billy from class 4B. Or if you'd ever figure out what the heck long division actually is. We'll chat about the history of primary schools, reminisce about the activities you have to suffer through or maybe enjoyed, look at some exams, and of course we'll drop some facts and figures that will either make you feel very smart or make you wish you paid a bit more attention. As always, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session where I'll answer your questions, possibly with some accuracy. Sound good? Great. Let's hop right into it. The primary school years. If the primary school experience was a 3-course meal, these years would be the hearty main course, sandwiched between the hors d'oeuvres of year 3 and the terrifying dessert that is secondary school. Let's start with year 4. Now this is the year where things start to get serious. You've stopped being the babies of the school, but you haven't yet hit the dizzying heights of year 6 superiority. Year 4's that sweet spot. You're usually around 8 or 9 years old, just starting to get a handle of this whole school thing. The activities are still fun, but with a dash of more responsibility. Remember school trips? Year 4 was probably when you had your first big trip, or maybe you're just about to have it. Pay maybe to a museum, or if you're really lucky, to a historic castle. This was the year where you were trusted to stay away from the gift shop long enough to actually learn something. Teachers always seemed to have this desperate hope that you would come back brimming with knowledge, but all you know is just how memorized you were of the price of a foam sword. Speaking of swords, who could forget the classic Year 4 history project on the Romans? Nothing like a group of 9-year-olds running around in homemade togas and cardboard helmets to bring history to life, right? Year 5 though, that's where things start to heat up. The science experiments get a little messier, the math problems a bit trickier, and the playground politics, we won't get to that. Year 5 is where you learn the dark arts of getting out of PE. You know, those creative excuses like, my dog ate my plimsolls, or I think I've suddenly developed a rare condition where I can't run. But despite your best efforts, you're likely still stuck doing those dreaded cross-country runs. Why do they always think running through a field in the middle of winter was character building? I don't remember developing character, just a permanent hatred of mud. Then we hit year 6, the pinnacle, the climax, the end of an era. You're the kings and queens of the school. The year 6 disco royalty. And let's not forget the dreaded SAT exams that loomed like a dark cloud over the summer term. The SATs were the final boss of primary schools, the one thing standing between you and the promise of an endless summer holiday. But year 6 wasn't all doom and gloom, it was also the year of the epic school play. Whether you were cast as the lead or a humble tree, it didn't really matter. This was your chance to shine, or have your parents record your every awkward move on a clunky camcorder. And who could forget the residential trips? A few days away from home where you learned important life skills on how to make a bed, why you should never eat 4 chocolate bars in one go, and the art of surviving on minimal sleep. It's pretty much my life at the moment. Activities like abseiling, orienteering and archery made you feel like a miniature Bear Grylls, except for the part where you refused to touch anything remotely dirty. But at the end of it all, you came back feeling like you conquered Everest. Or at least the climbing wall. So there you have it, years 4, 5 and 6, the golden years of primary school. Fun-filled, slightly traumatic, but undeniably formative. And just think, if you hadn't spent all that time gluing macaroni to paper and trying to figure out what a prime number is, you might not be listening to this podcast today. Now let's take a quick jaunt back in time, shall we? Before we had the primary school we know and tolerate today, education looked a lot different. I'm talking different like no computers, no calculators, and no comfort break different. So how can we get from the one-room schoolhouse to the modern primary school? Well, buckle up, because it's time for a brief history lesson. I apologise. Primary education, as we know it, really got started in the 19th century. Before that, education was mostly for the wealthy, or at least those who could afford it. Poor kids, well, they were busy working in fields, factories, or worse, missing out on all the fun with fractions. But as society advanced, people started to think that maybe, just maybe, educating the masses could be a good idea. Enter the Elementary Education Act of 1870, also known as Forster's Education Act. This made education compulsory for children aged 5 to 13. It was the start of what we recognise today as primary school. But don't go thinking that Victorian schools were anything like what we're used to now. Back then, primary schools were often grim places. Think cold, unheated rooms, strict discipline, and lessons involving, well, you'll see. If you misbehaved, the cane wasn't just a metaphor, it was a real, very painful option. And yet, the system laid the groundwork for what would become modern education. Fast forward to the 20th century and things started looking a bit more familiar. The Butler Education Act of 1944 is where we saw the birth of the modern primary school system. It established the structure of primary and secondary education that we use today, more or less. Primary schools became a place not just for reading, writing or arithmetic, but for a broader education, though I'm not sure how much time we spent on that. By the 60s and 70s, primary schools started to focus more on child-centric education with less focus on rote learning and more on, actually understanding what you're doing. Radical stuff, right? But let's not forget that through all these changes, the core of primary education has remained remarkably consistent. It's about giving kids a broad base of knowledge and skills to set them up for the future. That and ensuring you have an endless supply of glue sticks. These days, primary schools are unrecognisable compared to their early counterparts. We have already got interactive whiteboards, iPads, and heaven forbid, Ofsted inspections. But at the heart, there's still places where kids go to learn, to grow, and to sneak in as much time on the playground as humanly possible. So next time you complain about school runs or homework, just remember it could be worse. You could be learning in a drafty Victorian classroom with a stern teacher wielding a cane. Education might not be perfect, but it's come a long way since then. So there you have it, a crash course in the history of primary schools. Not quite as thrilling as an episode of Game of Thrones, but hopefully it's made you appreciate the fact that your primary school days involve more glue sticks than corporal punishment. Now time for the dreaded word, exams. They strike fear into the hearts of students everywhere, and in primary school there's one set of exams that stands out all around the others: the SATs. Now, if you're not from the UK, you might be thinking of the American SATs, the one high school students take before college. But no, the UK has its very own SATs, and they're a rite of passage for every Year 6 student. Let's rewind a bit. Now, before the SATs came along in Year 6, primary school kids are subjected to all sorts of tests. In Years 4 and 5, you got your standard end-of-term assessments, little quizzes here and there, and maybe a spelling bee if your teacher's feeling particularly cruel. But these are just the warm-up. They're like the boss fights you have to get through before you face the big, scary final boss at the end of the game. If you've ever played Dark Souls, it's pretty much that. If you've ever played Dark Souls, it's pretty much that. When you hit Year 6 though, it's a different story. The SATs, or Standard Assessment Tests, if we're being formal, are the culmination of everything you've learnt in primary school. When you hit Year 6 though, it's a different story. The SATs, or Standard Assessment Tests, if we're being formal, are the culmination of everything you've learnt in primary school. They test your knowledge of English, maths, and sometimes science depending on the year. Now, if you're anything like I was, you probably spent most of year 6 alternating between thinking. Now, if you're anything like I was, you probably spent most of year 6 alternating between thinking, this is the most important thing I will ever do, and maybe if I hide under my bed, this will all go away. Spoiler alert, hiding under the bed didn't work. Trust me. The SATs are a strange beast. On one hand, they're meant to assess how much you've learned and how ready you are for secondary school. On the other hand, they often feel like they're testing how well you can memorize facts and figures alt on trick questions. There's a whole industry built around SAT prep, with revision guides, practice tests, and even SAT tutors. But let's be real here, most kids spent their revision trying to find ways to sneak in breaks rather than learning. When SAT week finally arrives, the atmosphere in the classroom is tense. The teachers are on edge. The kids are on edge. And even the class hamster seems to be feeling the pressure. There's something about those exam papers that make you forget everything you know about. Maths or English. Suddenly, you're not even sure if you remember your name, let alone how to calculate the area of a triangle. But somehow, you get through it. You sit those exams, you fill in those little answer booklets, and then it's over. So then what comes after SATs? Sweet, sweet freedom! The rest of year 6 is one long victory lap. You've done the hard part, now it's time for the school play, the end of year party, and the joy of knowing you never have to do an SAT ever again. Until secondary school, anyway. But let's not think about that right now. For now, just enjoy the fact that you survived the SATs, you made it through the exams, and you came out the other side relatively unscathed. Well done, you. Right, finally we're going to get into the facts and figures. I know, you're probably thinking, Ross, this is starting to sound a bit too educational for my taste, but stick with me because these are the kinds of facts that you can whip out at dinner parties to make yourself sound smart, or at least mildly interesting. Alright, here we go. Did you know that the average primary school student spends around 7,000 hours in school between the ages of 4 and 11? It's a lot of time spent on spelling tests, times tables, and trying to avoid getting picked last in PE. To put in perspective, if you spent that amount watching TV, you can probably get through the entire run of The Simpsons twice. But hey, at least in school you hopefully learn something useful along the way. Here's another fact, the average UK primary school has around 200 to 300 pupils, but there are some schools out there that have fewer than 50. Imagine that, your entire school population could fit into a single double-decker bus. On the flip side, some primary schools have over 1,000 students, which sounds a bit like a small town rather than a school. No wonder it feels like you're queuing for lunch forever in those places. And speaking of lunch, let's talk about school dinners. Did you know that the government has set strict nutritional guidelines for what kids could eat at school? Gone are the days of mystery meat and soggy chips. These days, school dinners are packed with all the good stuff. Vegetables, lean proteins, and whole grains. Of course, that doesn't stop kids from trading their apples for chocolate bars, but it's the thought that counts. Here's a figure that might surprise you though. According to a recent survey, around 80% of primary school children say they enjoy going to school. Now, I'm not sure if that says more about the quality of our education system or the fact that kids are just naturally optimistic, but either way, it's good to know that the majority of students aren't dreading the school run every morning. Finally, let's talk about class sizes. The average class size in the UK primary school is around 27 to 30 students, but there are some classes out there that are pushing 35 or even 40 kids. Could you imagine that being a teacher trying to manage that many little ones? It's like herding cats, if the cats were hopped up on sugar and endlessly curious about everything. So there you go, some facts and figures about primary school that you probably didn't know you wanted to know. Whether you're trying to use them to impress your friends or just filling awkward silences at parties, now they're part of your knowledge arsenal. You are very welcome. Alright, the final part of the show and my favourite part of the show, the Q&A section. This is where you get to give me your questions, so let's dive right into it. First question asks, what's your favourite subject in primary school? Good question. Well, I'm going to go with maths. Yeah, boring, I know, but I was pretty good at it. Now algebra is all I can remember. Next up, if you could go back to primary school for one day, what would you do? Okay, that's the toughest one. I think I would start disco in the assembly hall. Don't worry though, teachers, we'll get our lessons in by throwing shapes. And the final question, what's the most embarrassing thing that happened to you in primary school? Great. Love this one. So, I was really into singing when I was younger. I really can't do it now, unless it's karaoke. I sang Bohemian Rhapsody in the school competition, and I got last place. Or it might have been second to last. Either way, I didn't learn my lesson and started singing it again in secondary school. And then that went well, and then never again. And with that, we've reached the end of our Q&A section and this episode of Idiotsplaining. I'll be back next week for the bonus bits and the week after for another episode. In the meantime, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, wherever you may find me, at Ross Hoare. That's Ross and Hoare. But if you're in school right now, you might want to do that in your break. Why not send me suggestions of things to Idiotsplain on the platforms or contact me at rosshoare.com. I'll be announcing the next episode's topic on the socials and in the bonus podcast next week. Once announced, I'll want your questions and you could be featured in the episode. The music of this podcast was borrowed, from Incompetech and Streambeat. The Incompetech track, by the way, is called Werq, spelt W-E-R-Q. This is an independent podcast created by myself, so thank you for supporting small creators. If you'd enjoyed this, please be sure to share it with your friends and force them to subscribe. One last thing, if you live somewhere that's a decent time to wake up early, then why not listen to the Radio Folkestone Breakfast Show with me, Ross Hoare, every weekday and Saturday morning from 7 a.m. UK time. You can check out how to listen and various other things, including visiting the What's On guide, checking out our 24/7 schedule, and getting involved with groups at radiofolkstone.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of Idiotsplaining. If you liked it, be sure to follow or subscribe so you get the next episode when it becomes available, and we'll see you next time.